Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call this Clackamas Regional Water Supply Commission Board of Directors meeting to order. I ask everybody rise and face the flag and follow me the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Cindy, would you call the roll of the Board of Directors, please?
Yes. Commissioner Blake?
Here.
Commissioner Humberston?
Here.
Commissioner Kalani?
Here.
Commissioner Platt?
Here.
Commissioner Soa?
Aye.
Commissioner Weiss? Here.
The chair will accept the motion to approve the minutes of February 10th, 2014. So moved. Is there a second? Second. Been moved and seconded. Questions, comments, or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimous. Approval of minutes for January 13th, 2014. Is there a motion? So moved. Been moved. Is there a second?
Second. Oh, give it to Deanna.
Been moved and seconded. Questions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Now's an opportunity for public comment. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to make public comment this evening? And I don't see anyone, so we will move on to general business. The first item on our agenda is a Budget Committee amendment. Is there a motion for the first item on the agenda?
Mr. Chair, I will move that we replace Peter Kraft with Eric Cofield as a member of the Budget Committee for the 14-16 budget year.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It has been moved and seconded to approve Mr. Hofield. Is there any discussion or questions? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Item number 2 is approval of bylaws. Mr. Hathorn, you have a presentation for us?
Sure. As follow-up to our last meeting, we had a couple of edits to make those draft final. I believe those edits I made, they're shown, they should be, at least in my copy, they're shown in red, and they may just be shown as highlighted underlines and or strikeouts. Then there are 2 changes, one in Article 5, Section 1, adding the phrase "and authorization by each of the governing bodies of the respective participating member agencies." And then the second in Article 5, Section 1, which removed the word "entire." And those are the edits I had in my notes to make changes, and then we would be ready to approve the bylaws.
Okay. Is there a motion to approve the bylaws?
Mr. Chair, move to approve the bylaws with the amendments as presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and seconded. Questions or discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries unanimous. Item number 3, contract for billing software. Mr. Hathorn, you have a presentation for us.
I do. So,
I figured you would on this one.
well, this is your first contract as a commission in front of you, all right? If you recall, the intent, there were several intents of the formation of the new commission, one of which was to go out into the marketplace and be able to be more effective, if you will, in terms of being able to acquire goods and services. This may be one of the more complicated good or services that we can acquire for an agency, and that it's the core of the business information platform for it, the customer information system, the billing system, and the accounting system together. Sort of the history here a little bit was that Sunrise was in need of very much of a change for its billing system, and CRW was planning the same for it, and there are a lot of reasons why. The short answer is ours was horrible, it didn't work. And CRW just didn't fit their current operating practice. It was a little bit more than they needed. It was a little bit too expensive of a package, and they were going to go to a more effective use of a piece of software. So we started in the process of looking at, potentially sharing software. And the advantage to that is that if you've ever bought a piece of software, or at least one that has multiple seats to it, you pay both for a licensing fee to get the software, then you pay access fees for the number of users in there. And the biggest cost of that software oftentimes is associated with the license itself, and then the user seats are relatively inexpensive by comparison. Or they're a lot cheaper if you buy them in bulk, right? And so there's a distinct advantage if the two organizations were to select the same software to use. The issue here, however, is Sunrise is a little bit ahead of CRW in its decision-making in this process. But Sunrise had made a decision prior to the actual formation of the commission, or about the same time. And knowing that, the two agencies were looking to try to do this together, both Lee and I went out into the marketplace together and attempted to try to force the provider to write a contract to this new agency to allow both parties, both Sunrise and CRW, to join under a single license. And that license would be given to the commission, and we'd buy seats accordingly, all right? Now everybody's going to ask the question, so how much money we're saving by doing this process? I mean, that's going to be a lot of questions tonight. And I would say right now we don't know, because Sunrise has its bill for doing the implementation of that portion of the software, and it's attached. CRW hasn't gotten a bid quote yet. We were hoping one might come in today so we could share it with you, but we haven't seen it. But I've been told by the provider, because I've made it explicit to them why we wanted to write a contract in the name of the commission versus one separately for Sunrise and one separately for CRW. For the reason I've described, that we would expect there to be an advantage to us doing this for the reasons it indicated, right? I went even farther to say, look, this baby's been teed up and ready to golf out, right? So we had looked to try to do that, and Lee and I think put, a very important emphasis on the need to want to do that. After some long conversations with the provider, we got to the point where we could write a contract, and you have that in front of you, in the name of the commission. And work orders are then authorized under there for implementation, starting first for Sunrise, and then potentially for CRW if they so choose to do so down the road. Right? So that's what you have in front of you right now. So that portion of the contract was exactly the same bid quote that was given to Sunrise during its request for qualifications, and then ultimately a proposal from the providers that were granted for that. So that portion of it has now been translated into phase one of the contract, which is solely the legal and financial responsibility of Sunrise to pay for.
Okay. Before we place a motion on the floor, I know it's a little out of order, but maybe the commissioners would like to ask questions, informational questions of you before we get to the actual decision-making process. So is there any commissioner that would have questions of Mr. Hathorn?
I guess I would have one, if I may.
Certainly.
So we have now described this initial work as phase one. When does this commission become responsible for participation with the expenses? With the start of phase two, or is there some reimbursement for the work that Sunrise is going to be doing that this commission should buy into, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand your question. The portion that's now allocated as phase one is Sunrise's sole legal and financial responsibility to pay for. We'd have to agree to that. If you recall, under the agreement that formed this commission, the parties can allocate percentage ownership of whatever contracts or responsibilities they would do so by election.
I guess maybe that's the question
Right.
I should have asked.
Right, so you have that
Yeah.
responsibility as a board to make that allocation, right? And what I'm telling you is that, I'm directing the Sunrise people, and also the rest of the CRW representatives, that this is Sunrise's deal, so you should make that their problem, okay? It is in fact something that they've agreed to take on, sort of separate party of that. Not formally yet, they're gonna get the contract on Wednesday night, but they've seen the price quote, accepted the vendor's solicitation, and so on and so forth as part of that process. And to further answer your question, I think, Ernie, is to say, we've yet to see what the price quote is for CRW, and what additional savings would have been anticipated. We're going to have that conversation with the provider, that being Springbrook, and those savings would be shared by the parties. And it'd have to be done so after the general manager sat down and made a recommendation back to you folks, and how there might be, if you will, some reimbursement back to Sunrise, and then those savings also passed on to CRW as part of the process, okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Yes, it would have been perfect, in a perfect world, there's gonna be a lot of imperfections tonight we talk about as we move forward, that we both went together to make the contract, but it's just that it was such a timing piece of it, and such an important piece of it, and the fact that we're doing biennial budgeting, we have 2 years in advance to anticipate, well, how we might do this. Those decisions will all get made before we ever sit down as a budget committee again and do this out. So the idea was to create the opportunity for that to occur, then Lee and I's job to go out there and pound sand and make it happen, right? And that's kind of what has happened up to now. Proof of that has yet to come in, okay? But we've been told by the providers that they understand. The CRW can well make a decision if it's not in their advantage or the commission's advantage to go out and use another provider. Right?
Mr. Kalani?
What sort of training program, if Sunrise gets into this early on, then how would CRW make up the training program?
Well, recall each entity, CRW and Sunrise, will retain its customers and its customer base, right? So for instance, this system would be set up so that the first pass of billing and so on and so forth would only go out to Sunrise customers, and its customer service representative would be the people managing that. They would get trained first on the software and only manage their accounts. And CRW, if it so choose to join that licensing contract, would come in, set it up so it could bill its customers. And so the way it would set up, technically, the way this would go is each of the customers would be kept on billing routes is how it works, right? We'd be able to easily identify a CRW customer versus a Sunrise customer, and they would continue to get CRW bills or Sunrise bills respectively, not commission bills. Repeat, not commission bills. And the finances and stuff would be separated accordingly, just like the training and the rest of that would. So what would happen is CRW's staff would come on board with the implementation and its own training, and then 2 years from now, we would anticipate, well, both of us were up to speed in using this at the same point.
What about maintenance and updating of the software as time goes on?
Yeah.
Would that be shared by the two entities
Yeah.
once this 2-year period is,
Yeah.
presuming that there's a joint venture there?
And the maintenance is typically done based upon the number of connections, and that's the size of it. So that would be our likely suggestion, once we saw the actual maintenance between the two of them, would be the way you would split the responsibility of those maintenance contracts would be by the number of customer accounts that were being managed. And right now, they're pretty close to being about the same. Right? Yeah. They're roughly just over 14,000 accounts for Sunrise and just under 14,000 accounts for CRW.
Thank you.
Just to make sure that I understood you right, you said that this was what we're seeing here, this is what Sunrise will pay now. And then you said that you've been working with the provider so that when CRW comes aboard, there will be a savings, which should be less than this amount then?
That's the intent, yeah.
So then, if, we'll say that they come on at 150, so we're looking at a $30,000 savings that'll be divided up somewhere.
Yeah, and then the recommendation would be, and we'll have to look at how that works, but just off the top of my head, I haven't seen the proposal from the provider, so I don't, it's not fair for me to make a specific recommendation.
Right.
But it might be just split by the number of accounts.
Okay.
At the time.
Yeah, so, okay, so that's what I wanted to double check that I heard.
That's the intent.
That I heard that right. Okay, thank you.
Carol, you got a comment?
One more comment I would like to say is, as we move down this path, should CRW decide, yeah, this is a great billing system, this is a great financial system, we want to do it, we all of a sudden have a resource and somebody that has just implemented ahead of us, so the implementation should be easier, faster, and the training can be also minimized because we can call Sunrise and say, how did you guys do this, And so I think we gain a lot of benefit from that. And frankly, that happens all the time anyway. If, a city or a special district goes out and gets a software and somebody else already has it, you can call them and say, did you have this problem, what did you do? But I think with our close relationship, that's going to be even better. So that's going to just give us some efficiencies and savings that might not necessarily be dollars, but it'll certainly save time and get us up and running faster.
And one would anticipate, we certainly do, that given the way the system has worked, for instance, in this and many of these other ones, this being probably the more complicated of them, though, that when somebody were to call in, it could be answered by either party essentially, right? They could see that it was either a CRW or a Sunrise customer. So when we get good at this, all right, we can labor leverage those CSR staff as well, too. I'm talking acronyms, customer service representatives, between the agencies as well, too, okay? So this is, you know, we're standing at the door, you know, about to go in to see if we like the home, right? So we say we like the outside, and we build a structure, right? And now we're gonna go start doing the interior. That's kind of what we're doing, right? Okay.
Commissioner Soa?
Is there enough safeguards in this that Sunrise Water will never know who the CRW customers are?
I don't know about what you mean by safeguards. I think there's enough safeguards to be able to protect the customer information at the level of, the level of protection that's provided by either one separately. But one might see that it could be useful to actually leverage that labor down the road. So you might have a sort of a bank of CSR people that could answer either one of those people that were calling in, and you know whether or not they were a CRW person or a Sunrise person. The vast majority of business which get conducted by the two persons when somebody calls in is almost identical. And they just happen to have to know whether it's a CRW person or a Sunrise person to know whether or not the fees are different and those kinds of things, and the charges and so on and so forth that go to that are relevant to that. Does that make any sense? So you could actually share that information in the same billing system.
Well, having come from the state of Oregon and to Clackamas County, these computer systems can get very expensive very rapidly. And it sounds like we don't have any guarantees about what our price is going to be.
We don't. We'll get to see it. The advantage of this particular product, and I didn't necessarily want to get into all the details of its particular selection. I think it's a different decision. But my presentation to the Sunrise Board for the advantage here is that this is a purely cloud-based product. And so the product sits out away from a hardware installation. So it sits out in the cloud. And the advantage to that is that you don't have to maintain or upgrade the licensing. It just sits out there as a service. So it's software as a service. People just log into it. There's a secure socket for getting into it. And then the seats are just applied. So then you just buy access to it, essentially, as part of the process. The distinct advantage to that is that because the software provider is not having to maintain specific installations on all these hardware portions of it, the shared product itself is a lot cheaper. Right? Not only in terms of the licensing fee, but also the maintenance fees down the road. So you take a traditional, and this was true when we made comparisons of ourselves and the life cycle cost of this billing system. Although the installation charge and setup charge might be a little more intensive the way that it's set up, the licensing fees, because it's in a cloud-based product, which is so much more less as part of that process, and in a 5 to 10 year cycle is way less than the traditional way that billing systems are preserved from a maintenance point of view. The other piece of it is that, you know, if there were a natural disaster, we don't depend on a building or a physical structure to actually conduct business. They could just get on anywhere. I mean, literally, they could conduct business from Starbucks on a laptop. And CRW and Sunrise will continue to maintain its business, or could conduct business, right, without disruption. I'm not suggesting that we do that every day, but, you know.
But it's doable.
But I'm saying it could. You have greatest flexibility to, all you need is an internet connection to make the thing work. So, and it's completely backed up. It has all the secure services to it and everything else as part of that process. So.
I have a contract question.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I understood this correctly. You, as SWA, are going to contract with this company to provide this service. You're recommending that we do this as a commission, and the option for CRW remains open. If CRW decided that the savings weren't there or the system didn't work for us, my understanding is that we would not have to actually participate if we chose not to. Am I correct in that assumption?
You are in the latter part of it. The first part of it, I have to make some corrections for you.
Okay.
Okay. The contract is written directly to the commission itself, and the commission would actually sign the contract. because you, under the agreement that formed the commission, have the right to allocate responsibility to those contracts, you would do so, okay? That being this phase one piece of it will be solely Sunrise's portion of it, okay?
Mhm.
So that's, if you will, there's an applied, or it's even more than applied, a specific agreement that exists between Sunrise and the commission and to pay that bill, all right? But the actual contract between the party provider, the actual service provider, that being Springbrook in this particular case, is with the commission itself.
Understood.
Okay, and then yes, CRW could agree to join that license, okay, if it chose to do so down the road or not, okay? The reason that Sunrise chose or elected to go under the commission for its license instead of by itself was to allow for that joint licensing to occur. Otherwise, each party would have to go out and pay separately for the licensing fees, okay?
Mhm.
And this way you don't have to do that, and that's where the big savings should come in from the provider itself.
Well, the reason I asked that question is I think it might resolve the issue for Commissioner Soa in that if the savings that are being anticipated are not realized or some other hitch in the get-along comes along, then we're not, the CRW is actually not bound at this point by this contract. Only the commission is bound by the contract.
That's correct. And then
Okay.
Sunrise is also then bound to pay for phase one.
Understood. So that was the only question I had. Is there any other questions from anyone? Sir?
I'm Eric Hokel. I'm not on the commission, but I have a question because I was closely related to the implementation of the transit billing system for the Water Bureau, Portland Water Bureau. And there's two costs usually typically to the software. One is the software itself, the other is the integrator or implementator. Am I to assume that Springbrook is going to be both?
Yes.
Okay, then the other question is, what is the cost of the license just by itself, and what is the cost of each seat? I don't have, obviously, the contract in front of me, but if you're gonna be buying a license under the commission, and it happens to be that CRW would like to participate, would they, in fact, have some kind of a reimbursement to Sunrise for their portion of the license?
That's what we were talking about, yes, correct.
You know, and so on what basis would that be reimbursed?
Well, we said we'd have to come up with the whole predication of the agreement that formed the commission was to do this on a fair basis, and it would be done by the board's decision. The general manager will make a recommendation, but largely, if I anticipate having to make that decision, would be done based upon the number of seats, number of connections, basically the number of connections that are in there, I'm sorry, the number of seats.
Speak up a little, please, would you
Yeah,
read?
based upon the number of connections. That's the way the fees are charged in large part anyway. That's how the pricing is done
Okay.
on the software provider side.
Are there any safeguards in the contract to come back against the provider if this thing doesn't work and it blows up or whatever?
Sure, yeah, we have, we don't have to pay them. That's the biggest portion of it, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't do you any good if you're trying to get a bill out.
Yeah, well, I mean, you take that risk regardless of what time you're gonna switch to a new billing system.
And in a cloud-based system, what assurances do we have that information is going to be secure from third parties that are not related to either one of the districts?
It meets all the National Institutes of Standards and Technologies for security. There's the issue of security in cloud-based services that come up a lot for folks. The federal government has recently, for instance, made a big play to go to the cloud, and other providers have gone to the cloud for services. And those security systems are by far greater and more intensive than we would ever have alone. I can tell you, for instance, this, all right? So, give you an example. So right now, our billing system sits on a Sunrise server. So it's a little rack of computers in our own
Yeah,
facility, right?
I understand.
Well, let me finish my question. My answer to your question was, right, I bet you any high school kid can get into that thing. We just don't have sophistications. We have very simple firewalls. They're very simple processes to play. We don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to protect access through those portals. That's the advantage you get when you go out to a group setting, is this company is providing that service for you on a group basis. So you get to pay for the cost of scales of economy for the types of security. We could never afford the level of security that Springbrook would for their system, for our own system.
I was just thinking of the Springbrook employees and or the cloud provider.
Well, you're gonna have that problem regardless, because even with the installation we have right now, even though that piece of software is sitting inside of Sunrise, it's sitting on a platter that we buy, but the access to it, including the database that's owned by it, is by the provider only. They own the database itself.
They do.
They do.
Let's
Yep.
switch.
And that's pretty typical of all these software providers. They have access to it, and it's their database, because they actually set the structure to it to match their software.
That's your current system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in this particular system, this is the same way. They have the database. The nice thing about it is we have within the license agreements the most liberal portion of it, which is Sunrise, and we get into this detail, but we actually own the data with Springbrook. For instance, we have a contract with a company called Systems and Software right now to provide a product for us called Requester. We do not own the data in that product.
Ron, go ahead.
With this new system, then, with our existing system, the company owns the little gizmo that just got all the data in it. And who owns the cloud,
They do.
or the data that's in the cloud?
Yeah, they rent space out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they rent space out, so do they have access to your space?
Yeah, they do. They create the space for us, yeah.
Okay, but so if you have information up there, they have access to that?
Well-
The same as, or is it harder to get to?
They don't, I mean, they own the data in the sense that they manage the database, just like our provider manages the database that we currently have. So they could go in there, any provider who wanted to have somebody run a log and take the data out of any one of those systems, those systems could do so. Okay, you're gonna buy a third-party vendor for a data product and mount that data up under that license, there's gonna be sitting out under somebody else's control regardless. The same true as for CRW's current system. It's mounted on a hardware platform here. That data set is owned by another provider, okay, and it's managed by another provider, and they have access to that data.
So does your contract have a provision for instances where there's a breach of the cloud-based information?
We do, there's a damages clause in there, but the problem with that is you know, the only way you're gonna prove those damages, like any of the other cases, you would end up having to go to court. But there is a damages clause in there, yeah.
Any other questions?
Questions for Carol. What's the matter with the system we have now?
The system we have now functions just fine. It's a little difficult sometimes to get the information in and out. It's actually a much bigger system than we need for what we're trying to do. But it works just fine. It's just ease of use is kind of a problem. And we have had it for, I think about 8 or 9 years. And from my perspective, we don't have very good customer service on the Eden system that we currently use. We call them or email them with questions or concerns, and they don't necessarily get back to us right away. A particular example is when we were setting up the ability to take payments over the web. They sent us some paperwork, we filled it out, sent it back to them, didn't hear for a while, called them up and they said, oh, now we need this. And they sent us another batch of paperwork, and then waited a little while, still didn't hear, and I'm talking to them saying, this is your job. You have set this up for other people. You know, I don't set up web-based payment systems for anybody, so I'm relying on your input and guidance to get this to happen. And it took about 6 months to get it up and running, even though it was something that they had installed for hundreds of other customers. So they are relatively local. They're in near Redmond, Washington. So, you know, they're fairly close by, but they're just not very responsive.
If we jump the present system somewhere down the line, is it a valuable system, or is this a leader or lost? We lose money on it.
We paid if I recall, about $350,000 to purchase and install this system 8 or 9 years ago, whatever it was. And we currently pay $28,000 to $30,000 a year for the maintenance of the system and the database. So it appears to me that our annual cost would go down if we jumped on board with this, and it also looks like the initial setup and conversion would cost less than what we had invested in the ED system, but no, we wouldn't get any money back from the system. We can't like sell any unused portion back. It's just done.
See, that's a $12,000 difference per year, just in the cost that between what you're paying now and what SWA would be paying just on the proposal that's in front of us.
So even if that doubled, it's still a savings for, and it's likely to not double, it's likely to be less than that, but it's still a savings on the CRW side.
As a relative measure, we pay just over $40,000 a year currently for maintenance fees.
Cindy?
Carol, the ease of installation, we had quite a bit of difficulty installing Eden. And if I remember correctly, that cost us additional funds as well. Will the ease of installation be significant or not? I mean, because I can't picture us going through that.
It's hard for me to address that. However, I wasn't here when the Eden system was installed, but I have participated in finance and accounting system installations at Apple Computer, at the Greenbrier companies that own Gunderson, and at the city of Lake Oswego. So I've done this before, and there are ways to make it a smoother process. I've got quite a lot of
And
experience in
save
it.
us some money. I mean, because if we look at historically, the problems cost us money the last time, so that should save us additional money down the road.
Just real quick, my theory on systems is if you want to do exactly the same thing that you have always done and put it in a new system and get out exactly what you have always gotten out, you're not going to be very satisfied with the implementation. What you need to do, in my mind, is look at what information do you need out of the system, and then what process do you need to work through the system to get that.
Thank you.
And I think that's where a lot of people get hung up on conversions and implementations.
Thank you.
Mr. Russell?
Mr. Hofield reminds me of the complaints that you had in that, or we read in the Oregonian about the switchover in the water accounts in the city of Portland. And I just read an article here this weekend about we had a near solar flare that could have affected our total technology operations around the world. So my question is, sometimes it's always nice to have a piece of paper with your account, and now we're getting so far from that, it's up in the cloud somewhere, we don't know what's out there. And so my question was the solar flare, and what kind of assurances are these cloud companies providing for that kind of occurrence, if any? I know it's an event, but
Well, the only thing it would depend on for this particular product would be access to the internet. And if they have certain runtime, if there's certain downtime percentages that are exceeded, they give you reimbursements. They have to pay you back for the portion.
I'm concerned about data loss. I mean, these solar flares sound pretty serious as far as
Well,
destroying your data
the
system.
threat of data loss on our system is much worse. It's called a fire. We're in an old building. That baby can burn down much sooner than anything else is going to happen. That's been a real threat for Sunrise. It really has been. I mean, we have a system that, we have these, sensitive data sets that are sitting in a system that doesn't have air conditioning, doesn't have the right environmental controls, there's no backup power, and the rest of it's all in there. It gets by, and it's gotten by, only by the skin of our teeth and by sheer luck.
Sounds like my wife's complaint too.
The reality is that, real fire is a real threat, and so is heat's a real threat to that system, to be honest, to me, yeah. And it's been a concern. And water damage and everything else, right?
It sounds like Sunrise is satisfied with the system. Where, if the commission goes forward with the system, where will it be based?
Again, it has no installation necessarily. The software sits out in a it's called a multi-tenant environment. So they manage the system in an off-site series of computers that are not only at a central location, they have 4 backup locations that are sitting in their system. And so those things switch on and off, you know, in a billionth of a second. So if one were to go down and switches back up, there's mirrored portions of how this thing operates. And that's how the cloud works, is because they can basically take advantage of the computing power of the world to mount this stuff up and have backup systems that go interchange as part of the process. So it's not, it won't be sitting on a piece of hardware either between CRW or Sunrise. Okay? It'll be sitting on a third-party platform.
Maybe I understood this one. You said 4 separate sites. That sounds to me like the backup.
They have a sophisticated series of backups, yeah.
Is there any other backup system other than those 4 sites on site, either at SWA or CRW? Or is that the backup?
The system itself, it's a complicated answer, but again, remember I told you, I don't know how CRWs is set up, I suspect it's similarly, that the software is actually mounted on its own server platter and sitting there. We then would have to provide the backup portion of it. The problem with that is the database is backed up, but the software itself isn't. So to get it reinstalled back onto another piece of hardware, let's say you wanted to back up, would take a significant portion of time. And they would probably attempt to try to do that remotely. To log in, you'd have to go out and get another place to put it, and they would come in, the provider would attempt to try to mount that software onto a third platter somewhere, and then link it back to that database and see if it would still run. Okay?
So you're talking really about a 5th
Because
redundancy
the
and still on
software
computers.
itself, the system isn't backed up, but the data behind it is backed up on our systems.
Okay.
Okay.
Carol?
We have multiple servers that handle the data for the Eden system. And we have backup through Polar Systems that back up the data. But
And ours just goes outside too.
Wade said, it's the software itself is sitting there in one or more of those servers that are, as we put data in, it goes there and gets saved, and then the data is backed up. But it would be a challenge to reinstall the software if it should fail.
Any other questions? Okay, hearing none, the chair would entertain a motion on item number 3, contract for billing software.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would move that this commission authorize the general manager to enter into an agreement with Springbrook for the new billing CIS accounting software, subject to Sunrise accepting sole legal and financial responsibility for this phase of implementation.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and seconded. Any questions further or discussion further? Cindy, would you call the roll on this, please?
Commissioner Blake?
Yes.
Commissioner Humberston?
Yes.
Commissioner Kalani?
Yes.
Commissioner Platt?
Yes.
Commissioner Soa?
No.
Commissioner Weiss?
Yes.
Motion carries 5 in favor, 1 opposed.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes the general business of the commission. What we will do is close this meeting, take 5 minutes for coffee, water, and restrooms if anybody needs it, and then reconvene in 5 minutes the budget committee. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll call the budget committee meeting to order. And Cindy, I'd ask you once again to call the roll, this time of both the commissioners and the citizen members.
Okay. Commissioner Blake?
Here.
Commissioner Humberston?
Here.
Commissioner Kalani?
Here.
Commissioner Platt?
Here.
Commissioner Soa?
Here.
Commissioner Weiss?
Here.
There we go.
Bill Blanis?
Here.
Pat Russell?
Here.
Cindy Lewis Wolfram?
Here.
Randy Ely?
Here.
Markley Drake?
Here.
And Eric Holfeld.
Here.
Thank you, Cindy. We have one addition to the budget committee agenda, and that is the election of a chair. So all members, please add that to your agenda item. And the chair would entertain a motion for nominations to chair the budget committee.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to nominate Pat Russell to be the chair of the Budget Committee.
Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any other nominations? Hearing none, nominations are closed. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Pat?
Okay, calling the budget committee together here. One of the other questions that I had was our format of our meeting. And I noticed there's no recommendation. It seems to me after public comment and close the hearing that there would be actually a committee recommendation if I would be in order. And there will be an opportunity for questions sometime during the presentation, and I assume it would be during the preliminary report, both at the biennial operations and then again at the preliminary operations. And perhaps both of those could be public comment inputs if there are any public present to provide input. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, moving on then. Can we have Mr. Hathorn provide the biennial operations plan? And if you can give us a recommendation of what action you'd like us to take, if any.
On the, well, I'll answer the latter portion of it. We'll come back to it again. I don't believe that there's, unless there's input from all of you, this is more of kind of an informational item as a whole. Okay. And before I start, I was remiss earlier by sending regards for Mr. Lee. He's very ill right now. Unfortunately, I spoke with him this morning. He did not sound good. He has a respiratory infection, and he was not talking so well this morning. So he's in the bed. He's taking medicine, and he was unable to join us tonight. So I send his wishes and his regards. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm sure he would have loved to have been here to meet all of you. So maybe I should back up, and there are numbers of other people here who have some of the background, but it might be worthwhile to add to this sort of a brief background to what the commission is, how it was formed, and what its purpose was. Because underlying that was the intent that we begin to look at a joint operations plan, and that would lead us to this discussion that we would have as part of this process. So, without going too far back, the day I was born kind of thing, but the day this thing was born was quite a number of years ago. And it's been, the discussions that may be as old as, thought process, maybe 10 years as much in the making, but certainly discussion-wise, way more than 5 years in discussion, maybe as far back as 7. The two entities, just by common sense almost, would look at each other and say, look, we're doing the same thing. Is there a way for us to do this together and put this thing together in a more effective and efficient way? And is there a way that we can make better use of not only hard infrastructure together, but also the softer infrastructure of people and other resources as part of the process? And I think that everybody agreed that, smart people can come to the table and do this once some trust is established as part of the process. Now that word is pretty simple, it's a 5-letter word, trust, but that's what it took to get there. And it took a lot of time of discussion to put these issues together so that there would be sufficient trust. And it goes all the way to the point where, one party would not be looking to take advantage of another party and so on and so forth as part of this process. But there are a number of preceding efforts that are like this that are within our region. The South Fork Water Board, for instance, is a joint operation and ownership. They actually share the ownership of a treatment plant between the city of Oregon City and West Lake. There's a more convoluted group together that's much larger in its size, the Joint Water Commission. Joint Water Commission is essentially all the west side providers that include the cities of Hillsborough, Beaverton, and Forest Grove, as well as the Tualatin Mountain Water District. And it once also contained Tigard as a member, who does no longer exist, was part of that party. And they have operated that commission under 190. They share jointly the operations and maintenance of that treatment plant, its facilities, and the delivery of water to all those parties as part of that process, as well as joint sharing of studies and other things that go along with the process of that entity. Along with preserving the separate and distinct operations of those distribution side, where they actually have customers within each of those entities as part of the process. So we said, look, as part of this process, once we said, well, we think there's enough trust on the table to begin having these conversations, we began to construct the concept of putting together a similar commission between the parties involved here. And we used to say, why reinvent the wheel? Let's just use a similar model that was constructed from before. So one of the first big pieces was the governance issue and how representation would be occurring. And that's why you see a three-member board from each participating, a three-person representation from each participating party on the present board, 3 from Sunrise and 3 from CRW. The notion being that if anything had to be passed, it would be passed by a simple majority. They'd have to get at least somebody across the fence in that trust in order for this to occur, right? And it's part of that process. And then in some cases, the agreement calls out for everybody would have to agree if certain things otherwise were to occur, like, for instance, transferring or disposing of assets between the commission and the kind of things. You can get a copy of the agreement. It's a public document. But then the model of that works pretty well. And it belies and underlies the issue of trust between the two organizations. And that wasn't always the case. And it hasn't always been the case historically. So this is something new for us, right? We're treading slowly and lightly, but I think the general managers, Mr. Lee and myself, are pushing as much as we can to try to make this thing happen once we agreed to make this to go. And so in the constructs of that commission and its agreement, it calls specifically for, you know, anything and almost everything to happen in there that we so choose through the board to elect to do, essentially, okay? Except there be no physical transfer of the plant that CRW owned, okay? Or of its related assets, or that of Sunrise, particularly into that. The commission could later decide to build joint assets if it were in this joint interest of the two parties. The finances and customers of each organization will remain whole. So whatever financial and legal obligations which were beholden to Sunrise will be held by Sunrise, and vice versa for CRW and all that kind of stuff. So that can be held as part of the process. It was made pretty important and pretty clear by both boards that they wanted to retain not only their customers, but a physical presence, and so they would continue to operate, at least for a while, separate, you know, physical locations for their customers to come and be part of the process and reach out to them and manage that issue. But that still leaves lots of room for the two to get together for everything else, and that includes everything as far up as the general managers, down all the way down to the people that are processing work orders and going out and making customer calls as part of the process, and how we go about doing that. And that's not contemplated in the agreement. It calls upon the operating plan to do that. So, you know, as we first stood at the door and said, let's take a shot at this, one might say, well, you could have just done this through a bunch of memorandum of understandings or some other kind of agreement between the interested parties. And that's true, potentially, and that is true, probably more exactly. But if you plan and organize to do this under a commission, I guarantee you my history has been such that that organizational and that impetus will drive that process much more readily than a simple MOU that's sitting between organizations, because it doesn't change the behavior of the individuals in the organizations themselves. And this will get people involved. I'll give you an example. So Lee and I, at some point, are going to have to get all these various groups, the administrative staff, the customer service staff, the finance staff, all together and explain to them, okay, what we're attempting to try to do, then ask them, so how best do we go about putting this together, and where can we make effective use of both labor and resources in both organizations as part of that process? Because the biggest challenge is bringing the people along with it. Because the other portion of it is that we know that we can go out into the marketplace and with the scale of economy, attempt to try to save money between both organizations, to give you an example. So if each organization is buying 50 ton of rock a year, I'm just making the number up, right? Okay, is it cheaper for us to go out and write a contract for 100 ton of rock, right? You probably can get a little cheaper. The more mass quantity you buy and those type of things, you can typically get them on a unit basis a lot cheaper. So we said, okay, look, we want to go out in those areas in which we have that opportunity. We also want to have the capability to go out into the marketplace as a combined unit, like we were talking about earlier, in a more complicated process of buying billing software, which is maybe the most complicated example of doing that. So we're at a point right now where we haven't done any of it yet, other than you saw the first contract go forward as part of the process. And what's contemplated then is at least some kind of vague vision, and I call it a vague vision because in the operating plan, what's described is essentially saying, we're going to look at both organizations over the next couple of years, and we have a couple of years to do that, to figure out where we start bringing them together, where we make effective use of that labor, and where we make effective use of our contracting authorities as part of that process. And that's really what this is about, right? And it says that we're going to do that, you know, the only way to do that is to start organizing, I think, by the types of services that we do. There's some unique differences between the two organizations that have to be dealt with. We don't necessarily have specific plans of how to do that. We'll sort our ways throughout some of this. But for instance, the organizations, one is a union, has a unionized labor, one doesn't, and that's an issue that has to be dealt with. And one has a treatment plan. Well, both of them have a treatment plan, but they're kind of handled differently as part of that process. But what's really only contemplated in there is the water sales made available through the parties in part of the original agreement. And then a focus on looking at bringing the organizations together. And that's what's in this operations plan. It attempts to try to look at that from each of the major functions. I didn't attempt to try to draw an org chart, and I tried to make that very explicit that that's not what was here, but rather to assess the organizations by function and where we could bring them together. A good example is that, we currently use the lab at CRW for some of the testing that we do. We have to do, each party has to do a lot of water quality testing. And a portion of the testing is done in the certified lab at CRW that they maintain. We get as good a better deal to go to CRW to do that than we would to go out into the marketplace and go to a third-party provider to do that. So why wouldn't we do that with them, right? But then it even goes even farther than that. If there's capacity, and we being Lee and I in the organizations have not had a chance to sit down and do that, but if we have the opportunity to take slack labor that's available and have only one party do all the sampling and all the testing and organizing that under a unified approach, it's much more effective than two parties doing it, I guarantee you, okay? So we're gonna get down into that level of detail, looking at where we would actually look to try to join that. And it tries to lay that out. Basically what it says is that we have a way to share resources, okay, under joint contracting. We have a way to share labor under an approved labor sort of scheduling between each other, okay, as part of that process. And we've agreed to that up to now. And the rest of it, to be honest, we haven't gotten to. And that's the very honest answer, other than the vision of it. So we're going to start delving into each organization by function. The problem with that is that in the process, we are required by statutory calendar to produce a budget. So we'd have liked to have a little more time maybe to go out and get some specifics. We don't have the specifics right now, other than I can look at it, Lee and I can look at it and go, look, we both do sampling. Maybe we could put some sampling staff in there as an opportunity to share resources. And here's a good example we already did before. For instance, CRW has its own IT person on staff and maintains an IT person on staff. Sunrise used to contract for that on a part-time basis. There's no reason for Sunrise to go out and contract for that labor when we can go over and use, if there's capacity, and I keep putting that, if there's capacity, then we come and use CRW staff to do that. The same was true for the GIS person. That's a Geographic Information System advanced mapping tools that are available. CRW has a person on staff for doing that. There's no reason we used to contract to do it. There's no reason we don't put those together and put those mapping services together. The same is true for hydraulic modelers, and the list goes on. And so what we tend to try to do is take a first cut at where there was those obvious places where they could be shared, and we just put placeholders for hours in there for that. Okay? And what's important here to note, and this is something we talked specifically, and maybe just two CFOs can help me in this regard, is that although there are specific placeholders held for here, that doesn't mean we're going to pre-finance those positions. And this is where it gets a little tricky. In the best world, we would have known, for instance, I would have taken 58 hours of that staff person and budgeted for a specific person for him to go over and do something with Sunrise or vice versa. And it would have showed up that way, right? And then if that person, for instance, came from CRW, you would reduce CRW's budget by those 58 hours, right? And we put in the commission, it would have been paid for by Sunrise, right? We don't know that. So what you have is you have a placeholder of 200 hours for a service we believe is going to be done. We don't know how much of that's going to get used. So we anticipate that this is going to be more like pay as we go and not pre-funded. In other words, the portion of shared services and other components that are in there aren't going to be funded instantly when the budget is approved, but it's done on an ongoing basis. Do you want to add something to that? You guys had those conversations.
Yes, we had that discussion of, we would each put in the $1,000 into the bank account when we get it opened in July. Therefore, we have a little money in there to do fees, things of that nature. And after that, then we'd start the billing processes back and forth and fund it as needed. If Sunrise has to pay $17,000 out in its service fees immediately, Sunrise will have to put in $17,000. CRW would not be expected to put that money in at all. It will all be theirs.
pretty much how we've done it. And on the CRW side, we have actually set up a separate fund that is the CRWSC Activity Fund. And so all of the transactions will flow through that fund. And it'll be really easy to report to the CRW board that activity that's going on.
Out of the CRW expenses into that fund and then,
And frankly, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, it's gonna be, we're still gonna incur the expense, say, of staffing, but if Sunrise, through the commission, is using some staff hours, then that would be revenue, miscellaneous revenue that would come in on the CRW side.
That is-
And vice versa.
Right.
Yes, and that is the way we currently do it with the North Clackamas County Water Commission. We incur the personnel services, we bill NCCWSC, and it becomes miscellaneous revenue to us. And we will be building a small company in the new software for CRWSC. So they will have their own set of books.
Mr. Hepburn, did you have more comments there? There's a breakout of some of the activities. Do we want to go to that level of detail at this point, or?
I think it'd be good maybe just to open up from my perspective. I think I gave you the general picture, and there's enough description, I think, that's similar and parallel to that sort of discussion, you know, that was presented to you. So maybe you have specific questions.
Well, let's open it up to questions then right now.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I have a question. Does CRW have more than one customer, does it serve more than just Sunrise?
We have retail customers and we have one wholesale customer. Sunrise is our only wholesale customer at this time.
Okay, okay.
But we do have retail customers, about 13,000 customers, I think, at this point.
Okay. For some reason, I had in my mind that Oak Lodge Water District was one of your customers, maybe not.
They have been historically, but not since the North Clackamas County Water Commission plant was put in service.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
And I think City of Milwaukee was a customer one time as well, wasn't it?
That's correct, and they currently are supplying water to their citizens through wells.
Any other questions, comments?
Just for the benefit of everybody, Carol, would you explain how the income from water sales to Sunrise accrues to the commission, through the commission, and back to CRW, how that process works? So that everybody understands how the income works.
Okay. The way I see it is the commission will bill Sunrise for the water. And right now, CRW bills directly, and they are a very, very consistent user. It's almost exactly the same amount every month. But the commission will bill Sunrise for the water. Sunrise will pay the commission, and the commission will pay CRW. So we will still have revenue coming in. And again, this is something new in my budget this year. I plan on that going through the CRWSC Activity Fund.
Okay. There's no rake off on the top or anything like that as it passes through, or any of that sort of thing? It's a clean pass-through?
At this time it is. We've agreed on a rate, and it is passing through in that way.
Now, at some time in the future, if the two boards were to agree and wanted to do something like that, to fund the activities of this commission, would that be legal to do under our agreement?
I believe
understand
it would
that.
be if both
It
of
could.
the individual boards, if the Sunrise Board and the CRW Board
Agreed.
agreed to
But
that.
they would have to agree.
They would have to pass.
Okay.
clarity,
That is correct.
I just want to make sure that's very clear, that there can't be any end runs or anything like that, that it's a very clean pass-through.
Yes.
Ms. Lewis Wolfram?
yeah, just for some clarity, Carol, on that. When it, Mr. Holloway said, I'm sorry, Mr. Humberson says that, yeah, I did. Yes, I did. Okay, let's let it dry. Court cases arising, let's let it dry. When he suggests it would be for commission, the commission activities perhaps sometime in the future, I just want to make sure I understand that to mean the money would then go from Sunrise to the commission and then stay there. pay CRW's portion of whatever budgetary fees were there?
No, we would actually move it all the way through, and then CRW would pay directly. We wouldn't offset any of
That's
that
currently,
revenue.
but I heard
Well,
future potentiality
I
there.
believe what Commissioner Hunterston was referring to would be if we decided on a different rate where CRW would sell the water to the commission at one rate and the commission would sell it to Sunrise at a different rate. So if
But again-
both individual
Yeah.
commissions approved that kind of
Yeah.
a methodology, we could do that. Right now, it's one rate.
And there's no charges past that, no extra fees or anything, got it.
Mr. Blake? No?
Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Apologize, Mr. Sauer, I don't have eagle eyes here, so.
My question is, Carol, is this water that Sunrise presently buys, or is this water that we're expecting to expand sales?
It is currently what Sunrise buys now. We do have, in part of the 190 agreement, that of our capacity at the plant, we could put aside up to 10 million gallons a day available. And right now, Sunrise is buying 2.5 million gallons a day.
Well, actually, what we buy is 122 million units of water right here.
Mr.
By
Holyfield?
contract.
Eric?
Yeah, it just,
And the average is a 2.5 million gallons.
you indicated that one of the districts is unionized and one of them is not. Which one is which?
CRW is unionized
Okay.
in general.
And do we have an issue, I mean, what's gonna happen in terms of plant capacity and plant refurbishment for the, as I understand it, CRW is the supplier in water treatment, as a water treatment? Is there any major expenditures that are gonna be occurring, and how's that gonna be handled?
The
For-
plant.
For infrastructure, plant improvement, or plant rebuilding, or plant replacement?
The plant as a physical asset remains the sole ownership of CRW.
Okay.
Period.
Okay.
I think Mr. Holford was asking, are there any planned CIP improvements relative to production? Isn't that what you're asking here?
Yeah.
You don't know?
But it's done by CRW, right?
Yeah.
Not by the commission. They own that
Yeah,
facility. What they do is they sell water to the commission or make the water available for sale through the capacity. But the management, operation, financing, and all the rest of it, control of that
And
plant,
then-
as a physical asset, is contained by
I
CRW.
have a question about that, but Ms. Lewis Wolfram?
Yeah, I had a ratepayer ask a question about that. And the understanding was that maintenance of that plant, somehow costs were going to be shared within the commission. Is that not a true statement?
Well, the way that the pricing is done is, the model that's called for is all of those real costs associated with the operation, maintenance, upkeep of that plant would go into the, if you will, the cost basis of that plant, and then the pricing of that water would be allocated accordingly.
Okay. So they're paid for within the pricing to
Right.
Sunrise. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? I have one other there, and I was curious if there's any more thoughts you can share with us, Mr. Hathorn, about joint capital improvement planning. Because I remember reading, listening to the video, I think in February or late January, of an example of where maybe there'd be a joint development of a storage, a water reservoir, and I think Mr. Sauer had some questions about that in the video. So within the next 2 years, it doesn't sound like there's any capital improvement plan that would be funding anything, but that you'll be conducting capital improvement planning, or are there any focuses that are shared among the two agencies that you're aware of right now?
Well, the biggest thing would be to look at the long-term water supply issue and needs of the parties. For instance, if Sunrise were, and it plans, I can tell you that it plans on taking much more water from CRW in the future. The question is, are the pipes big enough to make all that happen, right? And if not, then what needs to happen for that to occur, right? and who would be responsible for those upgrading. There's also the desires for CRW to enhance its service capacity throughout its distribution system, and that may involve shared storage on the Sunrise side of the distribution system, and that would allow for sharing of storage and then the ultimate transmission of water back into CRW from that. So those things like that have already been contemplated. We would start getting into combined hydraulic modeling, looking at the physical assets, their capability, and then looking at long-term demand forecasting together, and then putting together a combined capital plan as part of this effort over the next 20 years. That's correct.
So as part of the proposed budget over the next 2 years, you do have some recommended numbers of shared planning that you want to provide us this evening. We'll talk about it later, but.
We didn't come up with a specific number for, we contemplated that we would be back using some of the engineers in there and some of the hydraulic modeling staff that's in there as part of that process. It's incorporated in there. If nothing else, one of the first steps we talked about doing is getting the mapping and that GIS database of the assets sort of together so that everybody can see them together. Talked about putting SCADA together in the distribution side, at least the plant would remain solely the control of CRW for the distribution system, that you could see each other, and then start working towards looking at actual, hydraulic modeling between the two of them as well. And from that, we can launch a pretty good capital plan from that. That was kind of the contemplation.
Okay. One open question I had in my mind, just one other quickie here, and I'm not sure there's really an answer tonight, but because Mr. Hofield asked the question, that was one of my questions too. One agency's union, one agency's not. Kind of begs the question of supervision of employees if you get down to line staff. I mean, to me, department head interaction is not a big issue, but when you get down to dealing with the union and line staff management, I assume that will be discussed over the next couple of years as part of that.
It is, and without getting into, because we haven't vetted all the issues legally from that, but at least for now, okay, all the staffs of both groups would report back to their same supervisors at their respective operations.
Okay, all right.
I'll give you an example where there's a good reason for sharing some of that labor. For instance, CRW has a guy on their staff that's a specialist at pump rehabilitation, right?
Okay.
And, we contract out for third-party services in many ways for that to be done. There's no reason we can't use some of that expertise to come up and help us do our pump maintenance, right, as part of that process. In return, we have engineering staff that are very good at SCADA and really highly, advanced in doing that. And then we have a lot to share with CRW in that regard. So those kind of things we think will naturally be able to take place regardless of the institutions, if you will, legal institutions between union and non-unionized labor.
Okay. Any other questions there?
No, we would just issue work orders essentially, right, to get that work done essentially, if you will, right? Okay.
We're all human, so.
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps we can move on. Maybe an opportunity for public comment or questions at this point. If we have any public who would like to ask questions about the plan or proposed operations plan for the biennial 2014, 2015. Okay, if none, if we can move on then to the preliminary budget for fiscal 2014 and 2016. Mr. Hathorn, can you provide us information and a recommendation, please?
Yeah, sure. First of all, let me say that we probably need to amend the recommendation to say that we are in fact looking for this body to approve a draft recommended budget that would be forwarded to the respective boards of Sunrise and CRW for their review and approval. That is called for specifically in the agreement. That's one of the nuances that's a little different than we would normally do in this budgeting process. This is why I was uncertain of whether or not you could in fact approve it tonight until CRW and Sunrise actually got to approve it, then we'd come back to you. But what we're going to do is have you guys, folks, look to, if you so agree, to come together to approve a draft budget that would go out to those respective boards for their review, and then they would come back. If there were substantial changes, and Carol can give us a little highlight of what those substantial changes might be, we'd have to reconvene this budget committee to assess those changes that might be made, right? But if not, then they could come back and just be approved directly by the board here, right?
Just a little bit, but it seems almost like a reconciling item between like the House and the Senate. You guys can approve the budget. It would then go to the CRW board and the Sunrise board for approval of the approved budget. And if either of the boards made changes, as long as the changes are less than 10% of the budget up, then it doesn't require calling the budget committee back. My understanding is they can make changes down, and that is okay. That doesn't require calling the budget committee back. So I guess where we get kind of the interesting piece would be if CRW approves a variation of the budget and Sunrise approves a variation of the budget. When the commission comes back together, they have to satisfy both. So there's gonna have to be some negotiations to make sure that, it could take an extra iteration to get both agencies to approve the same budget.
And that would be after July, probably, or after June 30th, perhaps, if any,
No.
No, it would have to be before that, so.
before June 30th.
Yeah.
Okay.
I anticipate at the next meeting of each of the agencies that they would look at the approved budget, should the budget committee approve today. And then it would come to the next meeting of the commission, and hopefully they'll be the same. And then they can say, okay, you agree, we all agree, here's our budget.
Okay, sounds workable. Mr. Hopefield has a question, though.
No, I have a statement. Under local budget law, there is 3 steps that a budget goes through. One's the proposed budget, which is the one that I'm assuming we're gonna be discussing today. Then there's an approval of the budget. That's the approval process that you were talking about, and that's becomes the approved budget. And then if there are no subsequent changes, then it becomes an adopted budget, and by law needs to be adopted before June 30. So I'm assuming that, and you can have as many meetings as you want between the proposed and approved as you need to.
Probably the one thing that is a little bit different here is, as a council of governments, the rules are a little bit different, and the way the commission is set up, requiring independent approval by each of the boards, that kind of adds another wrinkle.
Yeah.
It boils down to everybody getting 2 bites at the apple, which is not bad, especially when you're first trying to put something together like this.
Sure.
It was contemplated that they would allow for sufficient control, if you will, to an oversight necessary in this process. I mean, negotiations to put together the commission included the fact that, some folks in the discussion said, what happens if one of our persons on this commission board were to cross the fence against the will and wishes of the larger board, and I have that agreed upon. Even though the agreement allows for that person to be removed immediately, they can by their own board, because the persons that serve on this board are appointed by their respective boards. That wasn't sufficient enough control by the parties in agreement, so we put some of these other places in play, which would say things like budgeting or transfer of assets, the other things would have to go back to their regular boards for approval as part of that process. So that was the second portion of that control. But also said, okay, this could get complicated, so if we can't come to an agreement, it also says that until such time as a new budget is adopted, we would continue to operate on the prior year's budget until such time as one would be approved as part of that agreement as well, too. So it wouldn't stall the commission or stall the ability to sell water in the ounce as part of that process. So we think we worked out all the issues for that to make it work, okay?
The only other question I have on that, Mr. Haffern, is did this committee meeting require public notice under statute or not?
Yeah.
Yes, it
So
is.
we are operating with a public notice issued? Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so the budget in general contemplates the 3 pieces that I laid out. We've discussed a number of them already, but just to re-highlight them so everybody understands, there's a big piece associated with the water sales. I'll talk briefly about that. Interagency labor sharing, and then the shared material resources that are coming in here. And we hope that they're kind of self-explanatory as you look into the budget, but we'll walk through these briefly. In order for the water sales to actually get transferred into the commission, there is a standing agreement that currently exists between CRW and the NCCWC, which is the North Clackamas County Water Commission, for the sale of 122 million units of water a year, which this is the one number we come up with where it averages out to 2.5 million gallons a day, okay? So that contract is between CRW and the commission. That contract was essentially given to Sunrise And Sunrise pays for that contract through the commission back to CRW, so it's a little complicated how that works. So Sunrise is the ultimate taker of that water through the commission in a contract, okay? And Sunrise adopted, if you will, assigned the responsibility of the sole payment of that, of those transfers of water through the commission. We would see that contract being transferred into the commission, and the nuance there is that there's a pricing structure called for in the agreement that's different than that's called for in existing contracts. So the terms and conditions of that contract extend essentially sometime into 2021, I believe. We would have to preserve all the existing terms and conditions of that contract in order for that to make that work, I believe. We would want reestablishing rates of pay and those other kind of things. There's a standing agreement. So if we put those water sales in the commission, we're going to have to transfer with it the financial obligations and responsibilities that go with it as well too, that were originally associated with that contract through 2021. Right? So that was what was contemplated, was pushing those water sales, and that's roughly 2.5 million gallons a day, or the 122 million units of water. When we first started putting the budget together, it looked like there wasn't going to be enough snow up on the hill. And so we actually anticipated there actually could be additional sales of water in there as well too. So it's actually beyond the 122 million units that were in here. It's 125 million units,
Yes.
isn't it? Okay, it wasn't a lot more, but there's still additional water in there as part of that. So that's where the water sales piece came from. I take a deep breath and then move on to the NRAC labor sharing piece of it. So again, following the operations plans where Mr. Lee and myself had identified potential opportunities for sharing of that labor, we identified persons. We went in and looked at their direct labor hour and then applied the appropriate multiplier of overhead that was agreed upon by the two parties, which I think is 1.67 and 1.68. Something in that neighborhood. The two of them took that. And then we then took our estimates and applied that amount of money to come up with the persons that are in here now. And you see them listed by their purpose. For instance, water quality would be the water quality testing portion of it. That would be the actual labor for it. Cross connection, and all the other things that we anticipated that could be shared in here, including SCADA, IT services, pump electrical, all the things we talked about that might be anticipated to be shared by labor and is listed as interagency shared labor. Okay?
And this is going back and forth between.
Yeah.
Mr. Hathorn,
Yeah.
on that labor sharing, it's based on direct labor plus an overhead charge of 67%, is that correct? I assume
Yes,
that's because of
that-
PERS and benefits, it's
Yeah,
that amount now?
that is correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we asked the accountants, what's the cost of that labor, and they came up
Right.
with a number for us, yeah. So that's how it was done. And it would change accordingly, and I think we would agree that that's how it should get done on a fair basis, essentially. Then we would put some monies aside that may be necessary to do the audit, additional legal services that may be required to throw a placeholder in for it, although, we don't necessarily anticipate having to get through too much more of this to get it going. Insurance pieces of it, and then ultimately some placeholder for other fiscal related fees that would be assigned to us. And for the most part, I think those were initially assumed to be just shared, right, costs.
They'll be shared.
To agencies until such time as we have another way to split it up when they become real, right?
What kind of insurance are you anticipating you need?
That's a complicated question. So without going into the long detail, the two parties actually are served by different insurance carriers now, okay, for long reasons of history. SDO is, and through SDO, Sunrise receives its insurance. CRW receives its insurance through another provider. Philadelphia Insurance. And what we'd like to try to do is get at least the commission insured together under SDAO. In order to do that, we are working with attorneys, SDO, to do that. There's some exclusions to their contract that were anticipated where CRW would agree to self-finance potential claims in those areas. And we'll have to go with the history of the claims that have gone on with CRW and its staff. And that was contemplated and anticipated as part of those numbers. You might say, so what were the numbers? Well, we don't have them yet, but it's a long story as to how that does. But the answer to your question is the commission itself would go out and seek insurance through SDAO, and the parties would take their appropriate responsibility accordingly. That's what was anticipated.
And so this is insuring.
And it covers general liability, automobile, all the things that normally would occur as part of that process. Right?
Okay, but it's essentially insuring the commission?
Yes.
So that's an additional cost.
There is a cost for insurance.
To the ratepayers.
Yeah.
On each district.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is far less than normal insurance, because we don't have any employees, we don't have to have the employee coverage that's normally associated with it. We have no vehicles, no equipment, no other assets that are associated with that. And that has, those are the expensive items inside the regular insurance policy that are paid by the two agencies.
Mr. Halfon, I had a question on that. I apologize, I don't get all the names correctly. Is it the West Side Water Providers? West Side, are they insured through SDA, their commission? Or do you know?
I don't know,
I
and
was just
I don't think
curious.
they are, and the reason why is because all the parties that are members of that are not members of SDA.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so you have the League of Oregon Cities, who would be a participant potentially, right, through the cities themselves.
Okay,
And you've got
right.
TBWD, who is in fact a member of SDA.
Right, I keep forgetting that cities involved there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And software licensing, so beyond just the billing and finance piece that we talked about tonight, there are a number of other software platforms that each party uses, including the GIS system, the SCADA, hydraulic modeling, and records management that would be shared equally, by the parties. Again, the same contemplation would exist where we would only have to buy one license and then share seats accordingly. And we should have significant savings doing that. We know that's true of SCADA. We know that's true of GIS. We've already had those conversations with them. We know that's true of hydraulic modeling piece of it. I'm not sure if we've investigated yet how DocuWare would work between the two of us yet, right? And we've had long conversations with Springbrook up to now as part of that process. And we have placeholders to allow that to occur. Then minor expenses associated with public noticing of the meetings and commission expenses, the $50 that you enjoy showing up here.
Those are paid by each other.
What's that?
Those are paid by
Oh, so what
each
are these?
agency. Just any expenses that we might incur beyond, they have to go to the trip or something of that nature,
And on the name of the commission.
under the name of the commission.
Okay, we anticipated a placeholder for that. Then going out into the supply marketplace and getting, rock and gravel together, chemicals together, renting equipment back and forth between each other, basically laboratory services. And some software that could be, I'm sorry, that's the materials and services budget portion of it. That sums up to the numbers that are shown accordingly. And what's interesting is we have 2 years to have to do this over, so, we really kind of shoot for the process, so, there you go.
Mr. Halfon, Ms.
Yeah.
Markley had a question.
Sorry.
Looking down here, you've got Prattville Chemicals, you say all those things. But this unit that you formed here doesn't really have any assets.
That's right.
They're not really purchasing any water as the commission, are they? Because they're
No.
still being purchased through Sunrise and
That's correct.
RW.
Yeah, in effect, that's true.
So,
They will pass through the
and you
commission.
have water quality, engineering, design, all this stuff. But the commission, why is that under the commission, I guess, is the question? Maybe
Yeah.
I'm confused here.
Yeah, well, and I think I understand where you're coming from, maybe you can help correct me, but this could have been done through a set of labor MOUs, right? Memorandum of understanding between the two organizations, I'm not going here. Lee and I had long conversations about how effective those MOUs are in terms of advancing the integration of the two organizations versus actually beginning to, if you will, budget for them and coming back to this organization and being accountable for the activities associated with that in a more visible sort of way. And the latter seemed to be the more effective way to bring the two organizations together in a stronger format at year 2 than if we were to simply do them by MOU. And that's just from, Mr. Lee and myself's experience having done, leadership in other organizations. So that's why it was done that way. There's no distinct advantage to doing it. That's
Follow-up question if I can. So, with the water quality, you have to do the testing. So the commission isn't really doing any testing per se.
No, but that's correct. Yeah, but it's allowing for that labor sharing to occur, we think, in a more effective way. Here's the example being, so if we didn't put this in here, if there was 10% or 15% of slack labor in the water quality testing staff, this is how this always works, right? So you need 75% of somebody, and they've got some extra time, right? Okay, well, one of the agencies is paying for that whole time. And so the question now is there 100 hours of that person that we can use and make that effective and then reimburse that organization for not having to pay for that slack time? So this is an attempt to try to take the slack time out of the organization if it exists and then also build strengths of knowledge and capacity where key employees might be an advantage to the other organization, like I talked about, the pump station maintenance person, the SCADA person. They can go down and help train and advance that organization, where that organization having to pay market rates for that training and advancement because it's already known by the other organization. It's a long answer for saying this is a way to jam it together because it'll force them to make that happen. If we just do that in an MOU, you'd be surprised. Sometimes somebody has to make that work, okay? And you have to then be conscious, very conscious about it, which is different than coming back to all of this organization, reporting back to this board on a quarterly basis saying, here's our variances, here's what's happening specifically with regards to that. And we chose to try to elect to do that, to try to drive that more.
Ms. Bright?
I just wanted to say from the CRW side, particularly looking at things like gravel, for example. We have a contract with gravel, as Wade said, we could combine the volumes and get a better deal. So in my CRW budget, I would move that into the CRW or the CRWSC activity fund to purchase that gravel, and I would reduce my general fund budget by that amount. So if I've got 15,000 budgeted, and the two of us combined can get the volumes that we need for 25, so my share's only 12.5, then I'm saving $2,500, and so my general fund budget's gonna be less by that amount. So that's where we kind of will see those savings.
Well, follow-up question.
Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
Picking on the gravel, on your example, but CRW has, let's say, $25,000 budgeted for gravel. You're gonna move 5,000 of CRW's budget into commission, as an example. But the cost to CRW is still 25,000. You're just moving money into a different fund.
Well, what I'm
Is that
proposing is if I've got 15,000 in my budget and Sunrise has 15,000 in their budget, that equals 30,000. But if we join together, we might be able to get the same volume of gravel for 25,000.
right?
So that's where we get the savings.
Yeah, and I get that part, but I guess in looking through this budget, there is an shared expense between CRW and Sunrise, and you've got some ideas of how those things are going to take place. Listed here, I mean, just looking at this, I have no clue as to who's contributing what. So,
At this point, we have contemplated that most of the services where we save, where we go jointly together, for example, the gravel or the chemicals of that nature, if we're both utilizing them 50-50, they would be split exactly the same, 50-50 would be contributed. If CRW uses 75% of that gravel and Sunrise uses 25% of the gravel, then we would reallocate the expenses based upon usage.
Let me have Commissioner Drake, our budget committee member Drake. Let me have the accountants maybe try to speak to how this would be paid as we go. And so even though it shows a $30,000 expenditure, the parties aren't going to fork up the 30 grand up front. They would pay for it once we started to buy that rock, right?
Yeah,
So you might explain how that was supposed to work, really.
So,
Or you just say
for
that?
example, on the gravel, we have the first delivery of gravel to the commission. And let's say we have $5,000 worth delivered, and CRW uses half, and Sunrise uses half. We've got 25,000 in the budget, but we're each only going to contribute 2,500 to the commission to pay for that fee. If we don't buy any more gravel together the whole rest of the year, we're not gonna spend the 25,000, and we're not gonna move that much money to the commission. We're only gonna move to the commission the amount that we need to pay the bills that are coming from the commission.
okay.
And we will attempt to try to look at savings that are produced by going in and contracting together versus if we would have bought the rock separately. It's not so easy to do all the time, but we will be looking at where we can to sort of document
Yeah,
that process.
and if it doesn't work, I think
We'll just
if we don't save anything, then we won't do it.
More questions, Mr. Sawa?
In the example you just used about gravel, is us, CRW and Sunrise working together to a memorandum of understanding or through this commission?
Through the commission, we don't have an MOU for gravel. at this time, and because of the structure of the commission and the budget that we're working on now, we can do it that way. But of course, the budget needs to be approved by both individual boards.
Well, that brings up additional questions. When I got my packet, there was 6 or 7 papers in here, memorandum of understanding, where we hired or cooperated in hiring people to do certain things. And I know at the CRW board, we never approved any of these memorandum of understanding, and I assume there's no problem with our manager signing them. But when will we get the report about what these employees carried out and how they were successful and how much money they saved us?
Okay. I have some of the MOUs that are out there, and 3 of the 4 that I looked at today were approved in the summer of 2011. So prior to most of our current board members being on the board. And so one of those is for the water quality testing, so we're utilizing our resources. One is for the GIS mapping, and it was kind of an implementation to get some of the mapping upgraded for Sunrise. And what's
And there was one for legislative
Oh, good.
liaison,
Right.
which was utilized quite a bit.
So CRW.
My question is not questioning the legitimacy of these memorandum of understanding. The question is, when will we get a report on what they produced and how much money is saved and all that kind of stuff?
We do show the revenue on our budget to actual reports, and I can certainly, at the CRW side, I can highlight that. I can make sure that that's identified outside of water sales and other revenue, but that is, most of that is other revenue. And then we do have some expense of utilizing a staff member at Sunrise for some of our legislative work, but I can certainly report that to the board.
So Lee and I anticipated at the next regular board meetings of each entity, we would go over that information with each of them board members respectively.
Well, I'm not really interested in a report from you. I'm interested in a report from the people that were contained in these agreements. So we know whether they're working or not. I mean,
Okay.
the agreements are working or not.
Yeah, Mr. Clapp.
A bit of a different area, if I may, water sales. I noticed we've created a placeholder in here for a bit of additional water sales to other than Sunrise, to the Clackamas County Water Commission, anticipation that some service and repairs to their plant may necessitate them having to buy some water from this commission. So I guess, am I correct? That is a future for unanticipated revenue, but it's being shown in this budget as a placeholder. Is that about what it amounts to?
It does, yeah. And the reason that going back to the commission, it's a complicated answer, but don't forget how the commission contract is set up. They share the fixed cost by ownership in there. You want the sales of that water to go through accordingly, and that's why it would go back to the commission, and Sunrise would pick up those purchases. It was intended to deliver that water to Sunrise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Sunrise is the purchaser or the North Clackamas Water Commission?
The North Clackamas County Water Commission would purchase it, and in turn Sunrise would purchase it from the North Clackamas County Water Commission.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Following up a quick question on that particular question is kind of to Carol, is the CRW sale to that other North Clackamas provider, is that capitalized? Does it include all the costs that we're talking about now as we share down the future? Is it similar formulas for costing
We completed about a year ago a complete cost of service analysis using a rate setting consulting firm, FCS Group. And they did a rate setting for the wholesale water as well as for the retail.
So
water.
that pattern would likely continue, at least as we foreseen. Okay, any other questions there? I do have another question. Just looking at the table, we have broken out by fiscal years, 2 fiscal years. Just an example, interagency shared labor, water quality, $13,000 for next fiscal year. Is that for both agencies? Is that their need, their total need for each agency, or is it shared need?
That's the shared portion
Okay,
only.
that's what I wanted to know, thanks. And it doesn't tell us how that's split out, and that's something that has to be reported to the
Correct.
shared commission later on.
It will depend on which agency is getting
Right.
the labor.
So we're not gonna get any of those answers tonight, is what I'm hearing.
Again, these are placeholders on activities that we anticipate working through the commission, and they will only be funded as needed when we process through the year.
But this is kind of the shared need estimate.
Well, we're thinking that there is some excess labor sitting in one of both
Right,
camps.
right.
And before we go out and hire somebody as an intern
Right.
position or consultant, we look to the other agency to see, do you have that expertise?
One
And
question here.
availability.
Mr. Hermanson?
As a control factor, I read these numbers as your best educated guess as to where we'd be each year over the next 2 years in those various assembly categories. Should you exceed those categories, would that necessitate you coming back to either this board and/or the respective other boards with an adjusted budget?
A supplemental budget would
Supplemental.
have to be passed.
Okay.
And it would require this board and the other 2 boards.
So
to take
again,
action.
2 bites at the apple,
Mhm.
plenty of control, so that these things aren't exceeded without the boards
Correct.
knowing what they're doing. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions there? Ms. Hafner, did you have further presentation you wanted to make on this?
Question.
Pat?
Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Lewis Wolfram.
Thank you. So, as I'm reading this, the income to the commission is roughly $800,000, or is that incorrect? Does it include the $178,000 on year 1? I'm just looking at year 1 right now.
It would include all the different contributions and the 178. And the contract services portion of the revenue would depend on who is utilizing the agency labor.
So basically though, the only expense which you're looking to get back to CRW and SWA is the $92,000 expense per year.
That would also depend on who is utilizing the software and the fees and how the fees become allocated. And right now, we just had allocated everything other than the labor, and the contract services, we had just allocated at 50/50. We don't know exactly how that's gonna play out.
Okay. Thank you.
I just have a question here.
Yes, Mr. Hopefield.
I see 2 things happening. One is a lack of or a loss of transparency of what exactly is going on in each district. Because we're talking about shifting budget line items from our own districts to this particular entity. Is that correct? Is that what I heard?
I would say that it will be in the individual district's budget as well. In my case from CRW, and I don't know how Lynn's gonna do the Sunrise, but for CRW, you will see these line items for the commission in a fund of Clackamas River Water.
But you set up a separate fund. Now you have to look at 2 funds, combine everything in those 2 funds to find out what's really going on. Is that correct?
We have several funds now, but yes, you would have to look at both the general fund and the activity fund.
And on Sunrise's side, we're contemplating just adding a line item for CRWSC within our materials and services.
Would that be a line item under each of the categories that we're talking about?
You know, just in total, and then it would be there would be additional information, just as our detail segment is out there, and we would show everything that's under that line item again.
So there will be a detailed,
There will be
there'll
detail.
be general numbers, and then a detailed explanation of what those numbers represent, so
Right.
that anybody that wants to look at it
Mhm.
will be able to see, okay, 15,000 was spent on rock over here, and we would know that that's what the expenditure was.
Currently in our budget, in our materials and services, say, professional fees, we list out how much we estimate is gonna be our legal, our engineering, our audit, and our fiscal fees. We would do the same for the line item CRWSC. It would be interagency labor, the software, anything.
Well, that gets back to Commissioner So's question, how are you gonna show the savings if there are any?
We would be reducing our budget.
No, reducing
For
the
those
budget
items.
is not necessarily showing a saving.
We would be reducing our budget for what we put in that line item.
But with the labor that was contracted between the two, because if you utilize the slack labor, for instance, if I use, for example, the example of the engineering staff from Sunrise, for instance, coming down and doing SCADA systems for CRW, and they purchased that.
Yeah.
Sunrise doesn't have to pay the full FTE of that person, let's say they pay, 90% of the FTE by year's end, and CRW pays for 10% of it.
How are you gonna
If Sunrise
report
saves
that?
10%, what's that?
How are you
We know
gonna-
exactly how many hours are transferred of that person's labor. If it
And
was
you're
Mr.
also
X,
not going out to contracting.
it's not going to
Mhm.
contract, you don't pay the overhead outside of that. So
And
the
the
typical overhead,
individual entity will end up showing some income from having gotten paid for, or reimbursed, for having shifted part of that person's labor into this commission.
then the savings that go along with things like rock or tissue or whatever it is that are combined together are a little more difficult to do, but that we know what we were paying per unit before we did this. And we know what we'd be paying per unit afterwards, and so we would attempt to try to, as much as I could, document that. The labor sharing is easy to do. It's there, it's transparent, who transferred the labor. But the other things is a little more difficult, but we'll be looking for ways to do that specifically.
Is that what the contributions are in the resources section?
Yes.
Is that what they are?
Mhm.
The actual cost to the entities for the commission to be established is the $92,000.
That's if everything took place in the first year that we have here,
Mhm.
for all the fees and of that nature. And if it was really a 50-50 split, that would be the way we do it. And our general fund budget would be reduced by that amount of money for our personal, that would be into the commission.
I'm just trying to think if there's a simple way to report the savings, because I think I understand what you're getting at. And in accounting ease, it's a lot more difficult to read. And obviously this makes it a little more complicated.
Mhm.
Maybe, and I'm just throwing this out there because, I don't know your workload, so I just want to throw it out there. Maybe a quarterly report of some kind where you simply take a two or three pages at the most, and you say, these were purchases that were made and this amount of money was saved. Because we purchased rock and it would have cost us this amount, but instead of it costing us this amount, it only cost us this amount. That CRW received this amount of income for labor they provided to SWA, income they wouldn't have received. Sunrise received this amount of income for labor they would, et cetera. Some kind of quarterly report that would make it very, very easy for the general public or our budget committee members, should they want to look again, and I wouldn't blame them if they wanted to be able to actually see it clearly and cleanly without having to wade through the more complicated budget documents. I don't know if that's feasible or not, but could that be considered?
It is feasible and it is required that we submit a quarterly report to you.
Okay.
It would be a financial report. that we
But
should-
something that simple?
Mhm.
The content of that and how that's presented is really up to you to direct the general manager to prepare that
Yeah.
information as requested.
In the engineering principle that I'm sure our engineer back there is very familiar with, KISS. Thank you.
I do have a question here, going back back to the two-year breakout. I was looking at the capital planning, and I kind of like capital planning, that's why I asked this question. And I see there's some software allocation. I was wondering about consulting costs. Are there going to be any consulting experts hired to help do some advanced planning at this point? Do you think it's all basically in-house labor?
We anticipated attempting to try to do that with in-house labor.
Okay.
We have,
All right.
between the two of them, sufficient, I think, engineering background, and I used to do that for a living in the private sector.
Yeah,
So,
I would
there
hope
were
so.
lots of master plans and stuff.
And would that be the same with any rate planning? Because we've been, one district has been spending consultant money on rate planning, that's why. Just curious.
As far as finance is concerned, we left that alone, if you
Okay.
will.
All right.
Because we wanted to be very, it was very clear early on that as we build the trust that goes on,
Right.
that they wanted a firewall, and those are the words that were used in negotiations, financially between the two entities. And so we left that piece of it alone. So any discussions about rates, charges, fees on it will be wholly separate by CRW's existing board, and be wholly separate by existing Sunrise board. Only if the commission deems for some whatever reason needing a fee or charge specifically to the commission would it have such discussions, and they would have to be approved by the separate boards themselves.
I don't know if I opened the public hearing on the budget, but formality-wise, now open the public hearing, request for comments, if there are any public that wishes to comment on the proposed preliminary budget. If not, we'll bring it back to the committee. Anybody wish to take some action here? Move this along here. We're 2 minutes to 8. Get this moved.
10 minutes to 8, I'll make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Can we get some language from staff again? I apologize a little bit, but I'm used to staff offering language, so we don't have to work so hard as committee members. But I did see kind of a recommendation to approve a draft recommended budget for
I wrote that
forwarding to respective agencies. You got that?
I wrote
Ken?
it.
Yeah.
Great, okay, Ken, go ahead.
Kind of way I offered. I move to approve a draft recommended budget to be forwarded to the respective boards of Sunrise Water Authority and Clackamas River Water for approval at this time.
Second.
Mr. Klein, seconded.
Mr. Chair.
Discussion?
I believe
Mr. Oldfield?
that needs to be a proposed budget, not a draft.
I have no problem changing the language.
Language is fine, staff
You
runs
have
with
to
it.
propose,
We're fine.
whichever you're comfortable with. It's fine with me.
I'm just following the law.
Proposed is a proper language?
Is the
Proposed.
right
Then I'll modify the motion to include proposed, absolutely.
Seconded was by Mr. Kalani. Do we have any discussion? Any questions of the motion or clarification?
Could we have a rereading of that?
I move to approve a proposed recommended budget to be forwarded to the respective boards of Sunrise Water Authority and Clackamas River Water for approval.
I'll second.
I will call for the vote. Can we have a roll call?
Commissioner Blake,
Yes.
Commissioner Humberston,
Yes.
Commissioner Kalani,
Yes.
Commissioner Platt,
Yes.
Commissioner Soa,
Yes.
Commissioner Wise.
Yes.
Okay, starting over. Bill Blanas,
Yes.
Pat Russell,
Yes.
Cindy Lewis Wolfram,
Yes.
Randy Ely,
Yes.
Markley Drake,
Yes.
Eric Hofeld.
Yes.
Okay, it's been unanimously adopted. Unless there's any other committee business, we'll move to adjourn.
The Budget Committee stands adjourned. We'll briefly, I'm sorry.
I just want to make one comment. Richard.
Of course.
I really appreciate all the work you've done on this, and I think this is really a positive way to move both organizations forward. I commend all of you, both boards, for putting this together and moving forward.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
And I will reopen the regular meeting. We have director's reports. Is there any director with a report to give tonight? Seeing none, is there a general manager report other than what we have heard?
No, no.
Then We stand adjourned. Home, ladies and gentlemen.